that is incredibly diverse and complex. Um, Denver's Asian history begins way back in the 19th century, um, as early as the gold rush of the late 1850s and 1860s and before then. And I'm an historian, so I have a deep understanding of that history and of the racism that happened in the 19th century, which the mayor apologized for last year. More recently, Denver has a fairly large community of refugees from the Vietnam War, 70s and 80s, as well as Filipino community and many, many more. So it's very, very diverse. I'm very familiar with the Chinese American and Chinese community through the OCA, which I've worked with in the past in a variety of ways. So yeah, I hope that's adequate. I think one of the best ways to make communities feel included is to begin with historical markers in the city that marks the history, the important history that we're trying to preserve. So you may be familiar that with the fact that the marker that used to represent the anti-Chinese riot in 1880 has been being replaced now by a much more appropriate marker. So that's a start. But I would add more to that. There's a lot more to Denver's Asian history than the race riot of 1880 that needs to be marked and recognized. And so I would include the spaces in the city that have historically represented this culture in the southeast part of Denver and along South Federal, for example, an historical marker that talks about the various layers of immigration that have come to the city and from what parts of Asia they have come, I think would be very important. So I would start with marking the history in the city. And from there, I would be more cognizant of the mayor going into all communities, not just treating Asian Americans as one conglomerate or a monolith, but recognizing that there are dozens of different communities representing the umbrella Asian American community. And a mayor needs to be familiar with every single one of those communities, with cultural leaders, with institutions and centers. So that would be the second one that I would respond to that. And perhaps a third would be when we talk about DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, in the city, often Asian voices are left out of those conversations. And so being certain that Asian American voices are not left out, but are central and centered in those conversations with unique needs and relationships. So yeah, so thank you for that question. There's an emphasis on African American and Indigenous and Chicano communities in the city, and that needs to expand to Asian voices and Asian American voices as well. So policies would be to make a much stronger effort in outreach to invite these voices to policy-making spaces where people can have an influence on the policies that matter. And those include policies around immigrant rights. I've done a lot of work in the immigrant rights community here in Denver, and that community often only includes Spanish-speaking migrants from Latin America and doesn't typically include voices from Asia. And so expanding the definition of immigrant rights would be important, and making sure that those voices, and I think another thing people don't recognize often is that there's a lot of undocumented migrants from Asia that are struggling along with other undocumented workers in our city to find recognition, to find representation, to be treated with dignity, to find a dignified wage and dignified work. And so that means anti-wage theft policies. It means policies where undocumented workers are better protected. It means that local law enforcement not work with ICE, which has happened in the past. And it means that all migrants and refugees are guaranteed legal representation when they come before any kind of authority or federal immigration. So those are things I care about deeply. There's an ICE detention center in Aurora. It's not in Denver, but it's certainly related to the work we do here in Denver. That's privately owned and privately run. And I would like to see that shut down eventually. So my focus would be on immigrant rights, migrant rights, refugee rights, and ensuring that everyone who works in the city, contributes to the city, that their full humanity is welcome in the city. I think that by highlighting that event that happened in October of 1880 and making sure that residents of Denver, that students in Denver, that young people, children in schools are taught about that event is the first step, because that event highlighted the long centuries old anti-Asian caricaturizing and dehumanizing that led to the murder of that young man that night. So making sure that that event is not only marked, but is taught in history classes in schools. I've taught about that event for 25 years in University of Colorado, Denver. I care deeply about it because many of the perpetrators were Irish immigrants that had been taught to see Chinese immigrants as competitors. And that cycle of hate is the way to address this. So hatred can only be addressed through education. And I would heavily emphasize the teaching not only of that event, but the teaching of the contributions, including the contributions of Asian Americans throughout the state's history, making sure that the Japanese internment camps are part of the curriculum that's taught. So that's how I would address this. I think what we're experiencing now with anti-Asian hatred is not new. It might have spiked recently with COVID epidemics, but it's not new. And when we can expose the cycles of history, we can stop the cycles. So that's how I would address it. I'll be the first historian mayor of Denver. That's the least a mayor can do, is offer a video. I think beyond that, a mayor should be out into the communities during these important days. I always attend the Chinese New Year and the Lunar celebration, and I always learn a lot. I learn a great deal, and it's very educational. And I think any mayor, at the very least, has to be out there beyond just a video. So I would certainly commit to that and more.